Hello, I'm glad you're there. I really appreciate your audience. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you've not done that. Then you really need to like and share this video. The topic is development of the face. We need to know how the face develops in the embryo, human embryo. So don't forget that the face is the anterior aspect of the head, from the forehead to the chin and from one ear to the other. Yes, by the wayside, let me remind you that the basic shape of the face is determined by underlying bones. So you have the individuality of the face coming from anatomical variations in the shape and the relative prominence of that you find that come from features of the underlying cranium. That's the skeletal framework. Then let me talk about the development of the face. At the end of the 4th week in the human embryo, you can see facial prominences or facial processes. The facial processes actually consist of structures that differentiate from neural crest-derived mesenchyme. When you talk about mesenchyme, you're talking about loosely arranged, undifferentiated mesodermal cells that can give rise to a wide array of cells like connective tissue cells and bone, cartilage, blood vessels, lymphatics. But in this case, we're looking at the face now. So you have neural crest-derived mesenchyme. That's mesenchyme derived from neural crest cells, differentiated to give you the facial prominences or facial processes. You can see that at the end of the 4th week. Facial prominences are formed from the first pair of pharyngeal arches. So when this first pair of pharyngeal arches appear, begin to differentiate to give you the facial prominences, facial processes. The facial processes or prominences we're talking about include 1, the maxillary prominence. So the maxillary prominence can be distinguished. You can distinguish the maxillary prominence lateral to the stomodium. The stomodium is actually the structure that differentiates to give you the mouth and the oral cavity. So it's very important. You find the stomodium at this stage of embryonic development between the pericardium. The pericardium is caudal to the stomodium, and then the cranial developing brain is cranial to the stomodium, and it's the stomodium that is going to form the mouth. That's the oral cavity. So you have maxillary prominence or process that lies lateral to the stomodium. There is also the mandibular prominence or mandibular process that you will also see caudal to the stomodium. Then you have the frontonasal prominence or frontonasal process. And the frontonasal process is formed by proliferation of mesenchyme ventral to the brain vesicles. The frontonasal process is formed by proliferation of mesenchyme ventral to the brain vesicles, that's the developing brain. And the frontonasal process makes up the upper border of the stomodium. So the facial processes that are going to form the face, I've mentioned the maxillary process or maxillary prominence. Then you have the mandibular prominences. There are actually 2 mandibular prominences. Then you have the frontonasal prominence. Some call it the frontal prominence. Then on both sides of the frontonasal prominence, you will now notice that there are local thickenings of the ventral portion of the forebrain. So on both sides of the frontonasal prominence, you have ventral thickenings of thickenings of the ventral part of the forebrain. There is a diagram here that illustrates the frontonasal, the facial prominences processes that are going to form the face. You have the frontonasal prominence, you have the mandibular prominences, you have the maxillary prominence, and then I'm going to talk about the nasal placode. The nasal placode is also illustrated here. By the 5th week, you can notice that the nasal placodes are formed, invaginating to form the nasal pits. So by the 5th week, you notice that you already have nasal placodes invaginating to form nasal pits. So you now have a ridge of tissue that surrounds each nasal pit, and this forms the nasal prominence. So you can see the nose is forming now. Then you have prominences on the outer edge of the nasal pits. These are lateral to these prominences on the outer edge of the nasal pits forms form structures that we call lateral nasal prominences. Then you have some processes also on the inner edge of the nasal pit. The ones on the inner edge of the nasal pit are called the medial nasal prominences. So now by the 5th week, you can notice that you have the nasal plaque formed, invaginating to form nasal pits. Then you have the medial nasal prominences and the lateral nasal prominences also formed. Then after the 5th week, development continues. It does not end at the 5th week. The next 2 weeks after the 5th week, development continues. And what happens? You find out that the maxillary prominence, I mentioned earlier on, continues to increase in size. As it's increasing in size, it grows medially. So the maxillary prominence increases in size and it grows medially. So what is the implication of this? As it grows medially, it compresses the medial nasal prominence. It compresses the medial nasal prominence. There is a cleft between the maxillary prominence and the medial nasal prominence. And that cleft is lost because the maxillary process grows rapidly, and it's that as a result you have that cleft being lost, and you now see the maxillary prominence and the medial nasal prominence fusing together. And what do you have as a result? The upper lip is formed. The upper lip is formed. So the upper lip is formed by the two medial nasal prominences and two maxillary nasal prominences. They all come together to form the upper lip. Then, of course, you still have the lateral nasal prominences there, but the lateral nasal prominences do not participate in the formation of the upper lip. What about the lower lip? The lower lip and jaw and the lower jaw form from the mandibular processes, the two mandibular prominences that merge across the midline. So that way, the upper and lower lips are formed. I'm so glad you are there. I really appreciate your presence. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Do share and like this video. You need to watch other videos on this channel on development of the maxilla, development of the mandible, development of the oral cavity. You need to watch all these videos. Goodbye for now.